Welcome to this edition of Out of Bounds. I'm John Luck alongside Mary Evers. And we have the state of the town, or the state of the city rather, the state of the state, the state of the union. So we decided, why not have a state of the teams?
Sure.
We're going to start off with the Boston Bruins, though, and what a year they've had going back to 2019. Obviously, they lost the Stanley Cup final in Game 7, 4-1. Mm-hmm. That's always fun to bring up for Bruins fans. Mm-hmm. But this Boston Bruins team, they had a real roller coaster of a 2019 into 2020 here, and you are a resident hockey expert. So let's talk about the state of the Bruins.
So after getting off to what was an extremely hot start, the Bruins fizzled out quickly starting in December. And a lot of their problems had to do with the fact that they cannot win in overtime whatsoever, especially in the shootout. Both goalies, doesn't matter which one you put in there, can't handle the shootout, but they're also not getting any support from their offense because they can't actually score a goal in a shootout. I mean, Brad Marchand can't even touch the puck, apparently, in a shootout. So
that's talented. You have to admit that. The fact that he can lose a game on a shootout, barely touch the puck.
Yeah. I mean, at least with Brad Marchand, he pokes fun at himself. He's not going to cry about it like a Celtic would do.
And at least he didn't lick a guy, because, I mean, he's done...
It's true. Yeah. That was like 3 years ago. It's time to move on from that.
All right, so you are talking about the hot start for the Bruins. They started things off 23-5. Since then, though, they are 9-7-7. And I think a lot of this has to do with that Game 7 loss at home. A lot of people were expecting the Bruins to come in, have, basically a homecoming game when you win by 7 or 8 goals in Game 7. The Cup's coming to Boston. You had the parade. Then, obviously, Tuukka Rask dumped himself on the ice, as he is accustomed to. And the Bruins felt like they came into the season with something to prove. And this is something you see in sports. It doesn't have to be just hockey, but basketball, football, baseball. You want to try and prove all those doubters wrong. So how do you do that? You win. Unfortunately, I think this has just been a case of the Bruins burning themselves out. And we are at the All-Star break for the NHL, so maybe this All-Star break and their bye week came together at a perfect time.
Right, and I mean, I think it's not only just because of what happened in Game 7 of the Stanley Cup Finals. This has been kind of like the Bruins' MO for a couple of years now, where they have this great hot streak and then kind of tank for a portion of the season. It's almost always midway through the season. But if that's what this is and they're going to come back, I'd rather get it out of the way now and then have this couple weeks off for the All-Star break and then come back and kind of maybe not get as hot as they were at the beginning of the season, but kind of slowly get themselves back to what they were doing before. It'd be nice if we had our starting goalie and the defense wasn't super injured all the time, but
we'll get to those in a few minutes. But the perfection line, obviously the top line for the Bruins, a very talented squad, Pastrnak, Marchand, Bergeron. Mm-hmm. But really it's the depth at those positions that, I mean, I'm not a hockey person, but what I've noticed is once you get to the third and the fourth line, you might as well just call those losses. Really after the first line, this team has a real depth problem, which could hurt them as the season goes on.
Well, I think it's something that's been addressed kind of slowly by Bruce Cassidy. I think he might still be trying to figure out what line pairings work the best, because you'll see game to game there is a lot of changes. Now it's taking kind of a little bit too long to get them all set, but I mean, with David Krejci back, he obviously put some offense back into it. Jake DeBrusk has been kind of hot and cold recently. He's either been doing really well or he was being benched because he was not doing well enough. So I think if those guys can kind of find a middle ground and not be obviously it'd be nice if they were scoring as many goals as David Pastrnak was, but they're not going to. It's not even realistic.
That's 37 cups of pasta that have been made, or bowls of pasta.
Yeah, so I think what they need to do is find kind of an even ground where they're not burning themselves out in one game and then doing nothing in the next game.
And there's been those in-game adjustments on the lines individually that Bruce Cassidy kind of changes them up. Do you like seeing that as a Bruins fan, kind of these different line pairings in the middle of, say, the second or third period?
I don't mind it. I think if it's one of those things, it'd be nice to be able to have line people that are familiar with playing with other members that aren't necessarily always on their line, because honestly, unfortunately, injuries happen, and you want to be able to make sure that these guys are comfortable with playing with as many of their other teammates as possible. And I think that's true of any sport. You want to make sure that these guys have a complete synergy with each other, so you kind of mix up the pairings. And sometimes that means breaking up the perfection line so that they sending Bergeron down in the second line so that he can kind of help spark some offense with the younger guys. And it does help. Of course, they're maybe not get the second, third, and fourth lines maybe aren't getting as used to each other as other teams have their set lines. So maybe they're not connecting as well as other teams, or even the first line is. But I mean, it's not. They're still second in the Eastern Conference. It's not like they're in last place and they're choking. So I feel like it's not a terrible thing to be doing.
But still, realistically, 9-7-7, that breaks down wins losses to 9-14 after basically a 20-8 start. So obviously there's some concerns there. And then, moving on here with the state of the Bruins, and I think one thing to look at here, and this is kind of going off script, but it's the play of Tuukka Rask. Obviously he's out with a concussion that he sustained on the road in a game for the Bruins. But Tuukka in closeout games. This goes back to that Game 7 loss in the Garden against the St. Louis Blues. We saw the stat and we were kind of amazed or boggled at it.
Yeah.
5-12 in closeout games for Tuukka, 1-4 at home with an .874 save percentage.
Right.
Is Tuukka Rask the goalie for the Bruins of the future, or is this maybe the start of the end for Tuukka?
I would not say he's the goalie of the future at all. I think that, he might be here for the next 2 or 3 years, but I don't really see it getting much further than that. He's already been on the team for almost a decade now, so he's had a very long career, and I think people kind of forget about that because when he originally came up, Tim Thomas was the guy. But he has played now over 500 games for the Bruins, so he's been on the team for a very long time. I would not call him the goalie of the future. Like, I wouldn't say Chara or Bergeron are really the future of the team, because they have been the team for a very long time, and it's hard not to be grateful for their contributions to this team. But unfortunately, as you get older, especially in a goalie position where you're crouched down, you're having things flown at you constantly. You can't sustain that for a huge amount of time.
So let's talk about the injuries. We talked about Tuukka Rask, but Charlie McAvoy, Torrey Krug, Daniel Chara, David Krejci, they've all missed an extended amount of time. And Matt Grzelcyk got injured before the All-Star break, so hopefully the week and a half off will help him out there. But how much of the problems with the Bruins here in 2019, 2020 is injury-based? Because those are big names that we're talking about missing time. And obviously when they get back, there's still that time that you actually have to get back to game pace. Well,
so that's the thing. I think out of those names that you mentioned, the biggest kind of loss when he's not playing is Torrey Krug. And he's your second defensive pairing with Brandon Carlo. But the great thing about Torrey Krug has always been that he's always been a defenseman that had offensive production. So every time he's missed some time and come back, he's been immediately productive on offense. Now, it's not something he's been able to sustain throughout multiple games, but he has made a bigger impact on offense, I think, than most of the other defensemen have this season, especially Charlie McAvoy. Charlie McAvoy has just been kind of getting in his own way all season. So I think maybe some time off would be good for him to kind of center himself physically and mentally to get back to this. But I think Torrey Krug is the one that you want to keep on. You're more worried about keeping on the ice going forward.
And I think this is actually a free agent year for him.
It is, yeah.
So that's more important when he, can get on the ice. So Tuukka Rask got injured. He caught a elbow from behind from an opponent in the crease, and it seemed like nobody really fought to stand up for Tuukka. And this is a problem that I've noticed in the past in the games I've seen. If there's been a cheap hit or a blindside hit, nobody's there to fight. David Pastrnak got into a fight, and I'm not a Bruins fan really, but if I see David Pastrnak in a fight, I'm hoping someone's there to help him, because that's your offense, that's your team.
Yeah.
There's not really that effect of the big bad Bruins that we're used to seeing in years past. So fighting for their teammates, that's kind of been a big item for me as a Bruins person watching from 1,000 feet up.
Yeah, I think it was interesting. A couple of days after Tuukka Rask got injured, Chris Wagner was on Zolek and Bertrand, and they asked him about why didn't anyone stand up for Tuukka? And Chris Wagner's response was, "Oh well, me and I think it was Corrali maybe, both tried to. He told Spiedel and Zoe that they tried to fight the guy, but he didn't speak English, so they didn't know what he was talking about. So which makes no sense to me because like 95% of the NHL are not Americans or English speakers.
Let me help out with this one. If someone goes after your goalie, I don't care what language you speak.
Right.
I'm going Happy Gilmore on the guy because that's the guy that's going to play defense for.
It's absolutely ridiculous. And I think it boils down to the style of hockey that Bruce Cassidy likes to play. And it's quick and fast. And unfortunately, a lot of your quick and fast guys are under 6 feet. 95, I don't think anyone besides Chara is over 6 feet on their defense.
Yeah, it's a pretty short team.
It's overall it's a very short team, but the defense especially, you don't really see that in many teams around the league. So that's kind of one of the things where you're thinking, as the trade deadline approaches, that they need to get someone who's big and can actually, protect their teammates.
So I want to ask you about Trent Frederic. This is a name I've heard about from some of the radio I've listened to. 102 penalty minutes. Just to put that into context, this is just this season.
Yep.
He had 35 more penalty minutes than he had all of last season. And he played in 55 games last season. So Trent Frederic, to me, is that guy that isn't going to maybe help your team offensively,
right.
But if someone takes an elbow to the back of Tuukka Rask's head, you could have problems.
And I think that even if he's not necessarily helpful offensively, just kind of getting that spark in that team is going to do them wonders. Because you see last week they had a home-and-home with Pittsburgh, and when the first night when they were at the Garden, Torrey Krug had 2 fights with the same person that had cheap-shotted Charlie McAvoy the year before. And one of the fights happened. They both went to the box for matching penalties. They came out and almost immediately started fighting each other again. That game, the Bruins won 4-1. So I feel like stuff like that happening lights kind of a fire under their offense to make them perform better than they had been.
All right, so let's do some quick hitting questions here. The trade deadline coming up for the NHL. There are some needs. We talked about this before the show for the Bruins. So what are some of the chief concerns for you at the trade deadline?
Size and someone who can maybe be inserted into one of the third or fourth line to kind of get offense going. Kind of like what they got from Charlie Coyle last year when they traded for him. Now it'd be nice if Charlie Coyle kind of, actually did it again, considering they extended his contract this year. But someone that can kind of inject some fire into this team, whether it's offensively or if it's physicality-wise, someone needs to kind of be in here and be a huge presence on the ice.
We talked a lot about Tuukka Rask today. Let's talk about Jaroslav Halak, the backup goalie for the Bruins. Last year, he was pretty locked down, and even this year he's had his moments. But in 24 games here in the 2019-20 season, 12-6-6, a .247 goals against average, and a .918 save percentage. He's been really hot and cold. He's been the reason the Bruins have won a couple of games, but maybe more concerning, he's been the reason the Bruins have lost a good amount of these games. And, there were a couple of true collapses there. I think one of the 3-0 advances or 3-0 leads the Bruins had, he gave up.
Right, and I think that comes down to the fact that, unfortunately, I think it might just be the fact that Bruce Cassidy is playing him too much. At the beginning of the season, Bruce Cassidy said to the media that they had 2 starting goalies on their roster. And maybe at the beginning of the season it looked like that, but I think that you have to remember that there's a reason why maybe Jaroslav Halak is a great goalie, could be a starter on another team, but there's a reason why he's not right now. I think he might be overworked a little bit, and I get what you're trying to do. You're trying to make sure that they had a very long season last year, and if they want to go for a long season again this year, they want Tuukka Rask to have kind of as much rest as possible, but unfortunately, he's your guy. So I think he needs to be, once he's back from injury, to be playing more, and that will help Halak kind of reset himself as well.
All right, so we are at the All-Star break and the bye week for the NHL, for the Bruins. When they come back to play against Winnipeg, they're going to have 31 games to go, 13 home games, 18 road games. And, granted, a few of them are close to the Northeast here, but still, 31 games to go, 18 away. What are your expectations for the Bruins, not just for the regular season, but when we get into the postseason? I
think that the Bruins, I don't see them becoming like the Tampa Bay Lightning of last year, because I think with the maturity of the top line and some of the defense, so with your captains and Chara, Marchand, and Bergeron, they're going to be like don't want to get worn down. They've done this so many times to themselves before that they know better than to do that. So I think what they're going to try to have to pace themselves. They can't be super hot like they were at the beginning, but they also cannot have a slump like they've been having since December.
So for me, you talked about it just now. This team is a team that a lot of them played in a long postseason. You talk about basically a quarter of a season added onto the 82 games. So you're playing about 100 games. It's very difficult to get back to the championship series, especially in the NHL. There are a lot of teams that I think are improving. Now, I'm not a hockey guy, obviously, but I think one team you have to look at is Columbus. They seem to have the Bruins number for whatever reason. And if this is a second round matchup, then I could see the Blue Jackets bouncing the Bruins.
Right, but again, I mean, we saw it with the Stanley Cup playoffs last year. You really kind of don't know what's going to happen. And the good thing I think one of the better things about hockey is that home ice doesn't really matter as much as it does in some of the other sports, because all hockey stadiums are loud. All of these teams, for the most part, have huge attendance rates. So it's not something that kind of swings it at all. So I feel like you kind of can never guess what's going to happen in the NHL playoffs before you get to the nitty-gritty of it.
Especially when you have Tuukka get your goal in Game 7. Just throwing that out there. All right, so that's it for the State of the Boston Bruins, and this edition of Out of Bounds will have another edition of State of the Teams. This time we'll be talking about the Boston Celtics. For Mary Evers, I'm John Luck. Thanks for watching.